Welcome to the 2015 Florida Legislative Update. Today, we are pleased to give you a recap of the bills that were passed and how that new legislation will impact your businesses and the local economy. Dean Mead is a full-service business law firm with 50 attorneys in Florida, and we are also impacted by the new legislation. We've expanded our footprint statewide. We have 5 offices: Fort Pierce, Orlando, Gainesville, Tallahassee, and Viera. Our attorneys practice in multiple areas such as tax, estate and succession planning, business law, commercial litigation, healthcare, IP litigation, employment, land use and environmental, governmental relations, lobbying, bankruptcy, creditors' rights, and real estate. We're especially appreciative today to the legislators who are here for their hard work and for what they do to make our community such a great place to live and work. Now it is my pleasure to introduce the Master of Ceremonies for today's program, my partner, Pete Dunbar. Pete leads the government relations, lobbying, and administrative law team in Dean Mead's Tallahassee office. Drawing on a distinguished background of public service, Pete represents and advocates on behalf of a variety of private and public interest before the Florida legislature, the executive branch, the departments and agencies of the Florida state government. He began his long career in the Florida government in 1967 as a staff director in the Florida legislature. He served as the Pasco County attorney and later served for 5 terms as a member of the Florida House of Representatives. Upon leaving the legislature, he held the post of general counsel and director of legislative affairs for Governor Bob Martinez. Pete later served as the general counsel at the Department of Financial Services and served as chief of staff during the transition from the Martinez administration to the administration of Governor Lawton Chiles. Pete is the former chairman and two-term member of the Florida Ethics Commission. Please welcome Pete Dunbar.
Thank you, Mark. I want to make sure that the sound is good. Everybody can hear me in the back. What we'd like to try to do today is introduce you to the changes and the important things that happened during the legislative session. There's lots to that. Some of it you will find in writing there. You will also find that there's something for you to take notes with, because when we get done with our panel work here, we're hoping to have some time for you to ask questions. So if you see things or hear things, we'll try to find some time to do question and answers at the end of the formal discussion. I'd like to begin by introducing our guests today, all important leaders in the Florida legislature. Beginning to my immediate right and your left is Senator David Simmons from Altamont Springs. He represents the 10th district in the Florida Senate, and that includes parts of Seminole and Volusia counties. David earned his undergraduate degree at Tennessee Tech, and I think he might have been #1 in his graduating class at Tennessee Tech or thereabouts. Later earned his Juris Doctorate at Vanderbilt University. Can I tell him who your famous classmate is?
Yes, sure.
And advises me that for a time he sat next to Al Gore while he was getting his law degree at Vanderbilt University. So anyway, he served as a member of the Florida House for 4 terms and was elected to the Florida Senate in 2010 and has been subsequently reelected. He currently serves on the Senate committees of Banking and Insurance, Environmental Protection and Conservation, Higher Education, Judiciary, Appropriations, Education Appropriations Subcommittee, the Joint Legislative Budget Commission, and he chairs the powerful Senate Rules Committee. To his right and to next in line is Representative Eric Eisnaugle from Orlando. He represents the 44th District from here in Orange County. He earned his undergraduate degree at Florida Southern and his Juris Doctorate from Vanderbilt. Did you all know that you all were?
Yes, we did.
You all weren't in the same class, were you? What that? Okay, no.
And since the senator was name dropping on his classmates, I went to school with Dan Quayle's son.
There we go. Okay, so we got vice presidents all over the place.
I think that's an upgrade from
this is good.
Gore.
Yeah, this is good. There we go. Eric was elected to the House in a special election in April of 2014 and was reelected in the general election last year. But he had previously served as a member of the House from 2008 to 2012. So while sort of considered at the beginning of his career, he really has more experience and as a result is one of the emerging leaders in the Florida House. He currently serves as a member of the subcommittees on agricultural and natural resources, the Justice Appropriations Subcommittee, Rulemaking and Oversight, the Committees on Local and Federal Affairs, and the House Rules Committee, where he serves as its vice chair. Next to Eric is Senator Darren Soto from Orlando. The senator represents the 14th district that includes parts of Orange, Osceola, and Polk counties. He earned his undergraduate degree from Rutgers University and his Juris Doctorate from George Washington University. Any vice presidents in your class, Darren?
You know, I don't remember. I think I'm still one of the old elected officials from there.
All right, there we go. The senator served in the House from 2007 to 2012, was elected to the Florida Senate in 2012, and has been subsequently reelected. I might parenthetically note that we have it on good authority that he will be leaving the Senate next year to do something else, and more about that later, right? There we go. Darren serves as a member of the Civil and Criminal Justice Appropriations Subcommittee in the Senate and the Committees on Environmental Preservation and Conservation, Finance and Tax, Judiciary, and the Joint Committee on Public Counsel Oversight, where he is the vice chairman. My final guest to the far right, does that work out for you, Mike, if you're on the far right? Okay.
I'll abstain.
Representative Mike Miller from Winter Park represents the 47th District from Orange County. He earned his undergraduate degree from
University of Florida.
University of Florida.
Absolutely.
There we go. His MBA from Rollins College, and he was elected to the House in 2014 and is currently serving as in his first term. So this is the newest member of the Florida legislature, also one of our up-and-coming potential leaders in the Florida House. Mike has 5 current committee assignments that include the subcommittees on health quality, K-12 education, transportation and ports, justice appropriations, and the Regulatory Affairs Committee. So if you would, we're pleased to have these very important folks here that were very much involved with what happened in 2015. Please help me welcome our guests, Senator Simmons, Representative Eisnaugle, Senator Soto, Representative Miller. I want to look with them at some of what happened in 2015. We're also going to look ahead a little bit because we have some things that are now pretty imminent. And I would like to begin first with Representative Eisnaugle, if I could. And Eric, I know with Senator Simmons that the two of you had worked on as companion bills legislation to expand the responsibility of the statewide prosecutor's office, that to deal with Medicaid fraud for bad faith claims on patent infringements. Tell us about what that legislation is designed to accomplish. Obviously designed to be helpful for efficiencies and helping business sectors. Just briefly, if you could.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that was the Attorney General Bondi's, that was really her bill. I approached her before session and asked sort of what needed to be done. I do that every session with the General, and have had the chance to file and work on a lot of great issues as a result. And this bill was sort of something that addressed everything from streamlining victim compensation and relocation assistance for human trafficking, victims of human trafficking, to expanding the jurisdiction of the Office of Statewide Prosecution to opening up the way we can use the funds that we receive from the Medicaid fraud investigations, so that we can further additional investigations into Medicaid fraud. And so it was really sort of a conglomeration of a bunch of issues that the General's office has been dealing with. And one of those probably things that, every 3 months somebody in the office said, "Oh man, this is a problem. I wish we'd get this fixed at some point." And we were able to include a bunch of those kind of things in one bill. And so it was probably not something that the media wrote a lot about, but hopefully a bill that is going to help the Attorney General streamline the process for the Attorney General in a bunch of different areas and make her job a lot easier to do.
Very good. David, I want to stay with the business theme, and one of the things that you worked on this year, I know it's not the first time that you've dealt with this subject matter. One of the popular vehicles for businesses to use is the LLC structural business. I know you did about 3 years ago do a complete rewrite as the Senate sponsor, but again, we're doing it this year. Tell us a little bit about the changes to the LLC bill or chapter for those that are using it, 1, and 2. I think you indicated to me when I was discussing this with you during the session, that there may be a little bit more that needs to be tweaked on this legislation in 2016.
Sure, and thank you, Pete. And for all of you that maybe it's your first time meeting Pete Dunbar, he and Martha, his partner, are two of the most respected governmental advisors in all of the state of Florida. And so thank you for having us.
Well, we thank you for being here, David. That's very kind. Thank you for all of you for being here. Thank you.
The LLC bill is something that the business law section came to me and asked that I, in fact, help them with a complete rewrite, which you've seen from a couple of years ago, and a lot of it was, really just exactly as the business law section of the Florida Bar wanted it. And then, of course, every time that we end up doing something like that, we end up always having glitches. And we have what are called glitch bills, because as we go through the details, and each of you as practicing lawyers end up looking at the provisions of what you have done, you know as well as I do that in my own having practiced law for now 35 years, it never ends up the way you exactly expect, and so we ended up doing the glitch bill to deal with various of the smaller problems, the inconsistencies that each of you have found. What Pete is talking about that I raised is the issue that as a commercial litigation attorney, I've been confronted with so many times in disputes between members of LLCs, and that is whether or not there exists a fiduciary duty separate and distinct from the fiduciary duty that is imposed in the LLC statute. And what the courts have generally found, which is probably surprising to those who in fact drafted the LLC statute, is that the courts have generally found that the mere listing of a couple of duties, such as the duty of loyalty and
Duty of care.
and duty of care, thank you very much, and the duty of care.
Is that your lawyer helping you out here? I like that.
See, that's the way we work.
Thank you, Senator. We appreciate that.
And those two duties that, in fact, while they may be listed in the statute, that's not exclusively the case. And if there's a common law duty, then the statute does not abrogate that common law duty. And so that comes as quite a surprise to some people. And I think that the concept that exists, that the courts have continued to impose, is that the full panoply, full spectrum of fiduciary duties exist if, in fact, the relationship between the parties is one of confidence or one in which there exists this reliance between, for example, the manager and the members of the LLC. And so that's something that's going to have to be addressed, because the courts are in fact, struggling with that.
David, thank you. I might parenthetically note, I believe this is in your written materials as well, and if any of you are parenthetically involved in real estate with LLCs, there is one specific restriction about how and when the manager of the LLC can transfer real estate and whether you have to record things. You may want to take a parenthetical note of that. But with that thought in mind, Senator Soto, I think we all at times pull out our hair about governmental regulations, can't find things, track down what the policies of agencies are, what have been prior precedents on it. You and Representative Eisnaugle passed a piece of legislation this time that will require, I believe, will require all state agencies now to provide that electronically organized, indexed. People can find it, people can use it, not just practitioners, but businesses as well. Tell us a little bit about the background of that, what it does, and what you hope it will accomplish in the long term.
Well, sure. In my 9 years in the legislature, I've not shown up for a year where there wasn't so many different dumb moments where we just needed to fix something because it wasn't right. And in this case, it was the fact that businesses and anybody who practices admin law in here, I'm sure there's a couple of you, had to literally get a public records request to find a prior opinion of an agency. So imagine if you're dealing with regulations with the Department of Transportation or Department of Environmental Protection. You wouldn't even know what prior rulings and prior interpretations were of those agencies unless you knew what you were looking for and asked for it specifically. For a business-friendly state such as Florida, that's unacceptable. And I got to give credit where credit's due. The origin of this bill was Representative Eric Eisnaugle calling me and saying, "This doesn't make sense. We should do something about it." I said, "Yeah." And he was like, "Do we have to do anything else, or is this like a yes?" And I'm like, "That's pretty much it." We're pretty informal in my office, and we both filed the bill, and it breezed through. And so now when your businesses are up in litigation with the state of Florida for different administrative proceedings, you will be put on a equal footing with the state as far as knowing all the precedences. And it shouldn't be some archaic system where you just aren't given the right information to make your case.
It's great.
Could I jump in there real quick too?
Absolutely, please do.
I can't really take credit for it because while I brought it to you, Senator, the Florida Bar really did all the work on the front end to identify the problem. First of all, they did a survey of the agencies and certainly found that some of the agencies were already posting their stuff online, but you'd be shocked at some of the agencies that weren't, and some of the big ones, some of the major ones weren't posting stuff online, and then as the senator said, sometimes you actually had to make a public records request to even get it, which in 2015 is just absurd, really. And
Absolutely.
So it was kind of one of those no-brainer bills. Once you filed it, nobody would dream of opposing it, but sometimes those are the hardest ones to get through, because they don't get the attention either. But the Florida Bar jumped in and we were able to get it done.
We made that before the Wednesday shut. No, well, I'll come back to that in a minute. So, Mike, I want to give you a chance too, because you had a sort of unique and business-friendly local bill that I'd like you to address, and then, but I want to, one, explain to us a little bit what the objective was about changing or modernizing regulations, and then two, because Eric brought up a good point, I'd like to know how you were aware that that was legislation that would interest you and you wanted to file and actually pass. So sort of a two-part question there.
Well, I could answer it by saying I realized there weren't enough bars in Winter Park, so I wanted to increase the amount of access to liquor, but that's not really the reason. It was brought to me by the city manager of Winter Park, and somebody ticked somebody off back in 1965, and they put in a regulation, what I guess at that point was a special bill. Now they call them a local bill.
Local bill.
And back when you were in the legislature, probably was a special bill.
Long ago.
So yeah, back in the day. So the essence of it was they put an extra restriction on restaurants in Winter Park, and actually there were several jurisdictions around the state, but Winter Park was the one that's in my district, that prohibited the issuance of a liquor license unless you had a certain square footage or a number of seats. So it was, I guess at some point they were trying to limit the amount of bars, really, but this is a restaurant issue, and so the city manager said we would just like to be conforming with the rest of the state of Florida. So it was that simple. And it was actually a great experience for me because it was really the first bill I had ever run through the legislative process. And as these guys will tell you, local bills don't get quite the same scrutiny at some level, but it was still a big eye opener for me to have to stand in front of a committee and somebody asked me, "Is this your first bill?" And I had to say yes. And then once you go through the first bill process,
it's like being a plebe. It's when you go through
the eyes open up and everybody says, "Oh, Miller's first bill. Let's see what we can ask him." And so thankfully they didn't give me too much of a hard time, and it passed.
Well, for what it's worth, we've already had a couple of comments come to us on that being a positive thing so that projects and things that were on the drawing board might be able to move forward in Winter Park. So let me...
Sure, and again, the restaurants that were operating under, it was really an oversight because the restaurants that had been issued a liquor license were then going to have to give their liquor licenses back, and there literally could have been restaurants closing down, and that would have been a tragedy. So in this case, it was averted, and hopefully moving forward, that would just be in line with everybody else in Florida.
David, I'm going to come back to you in a minute. We're going to start talking about some of the bigger issues, particularly with regard to the budget. But I want to pause just a minute because Eric, I think, started what was an interesting idea to me. As you've listened to each of these responses, someone has brought good ideas to the citizen legislature that we have. That's where it all begins. So my teaching moment to all of you is if there are things that are on your mind or might need changes, you ought to make sure you're reaching out to do it, because all of the four gentlemen that are up here and their colleagues, I have always found, Martha, Carey, and I always have found to be receptive to doing things like that. And I think as they've explained their personal initiatives this time, they've each explained who brought that issue to them. So maybe next time it will be you that brings that issue. But having said that, David, we all enjoyed the difficulties, not enjoyed would be the wrong term, all were fascinated by the difficulties for a very difficult budget session. And just for the benefit of everyone, explain, if you would, what LIP funding means and what the dispute was that created sort of this impasse that later had to be resolved in a special session. Can you give us just some background
Sure.
on what those issues are?
Sure.
And Eric, I want to know then, after he gets done, how you think those issues may in fact impact the business community, so just so you're prepared and ready to go.
Right now, what's happened is that after the Patient Protection, Affordability and Care Act was passed, what has happened is that the whole issue is, what about those individuals who are in what's sort of like a gap that exists, the gap between private pay insurance and those who have Medicaid. And I'm not talking about those individuals who are disabled. I'm talking about people who are not disabled, but in fact, and not talking about elderly care, which is a totally different issue than those who make up that group of people who are arguably able-bodied, but in fact receiving Medicaid. And do you expand that to a group who make more than the cap for Medicaid for the federal poverty level, and up to 138% of what that level is? And do we go ahead and expand that? And of course, you can imagine our legislature does not, at least the majority of the legislature does not believe that we need to be giving handouts to anyone or expanding Medicaid in its existing form. But we do know this, that the existing system of Medicaid is broken. It truly is broken. Why? Because if a person receives Medicaid and makes greater than the cap and the limit, then what happens is that person automatically loses all of his or her benefits, and mainly it's women with children, lose the benefits under Medicaid. Well, that incentivizes not working, it incentivizes not being educated, it incentivizes not being part of the American success story. And so what happens is that obviously we don't want to expand that kind of system. We all believe that there needs to be a change in that system. Well, what happens is can we take those Medicaid dollars, those dollars that are under what I call PPACA, Patient Protection and Affordability Care, Obamacare, take those monies that were being made available by the federal government, and starting out 100% paid for and funded by the federal government, ultimately dropping down over a period of 10 years to 90% funding. But what happens is that do you go ahead and take that money and provide health care to this approximate 800,000 people here in the state of Florida, who are the same people who are uninsured, who end up showing up in our hospitals and using the hospital's emergency room as primary care? What an insane situation. We have a group of people who are uninsured, who show up and use the hospitals. Why? Because these safety net hospitals after 1986, are required to take somebody who shows up, irrespective of whether they have insurance. And treat them to keep, and of course that's the humane thing to do. But how do you go ahead and how do you go ahead and compensate a hospital for giving that kind of care? There's another part of Medicaid that you don't hear about, and it's called the low income pool. LIP is what we call it. Previously, since the time of Jeb Bush, who went to his brother in the presidency and got the federal government to give us block grants. Block grants at that time as much as $2 billion a year of money that we've been dispersing under the low income pool to all of the hospitals to get the hospitals to cover this situation in which uninsured people show up to their emergency rooms and they give them primary care because these people have no insurance and can't go someplace else. So we have two sets of monies. One is this money that's available for Medicaid, but we don't want to do Medicaid expansion, an expansion of a system that actually disincentivizes success. And so, and do we continue to take this, at the time, $2 billion a year from the federal government to perpetuate the insanity of having uninsured people show up at the hospital emergency rooms? So the Senate came up with the idea, says, wait a second, let's go ahead and take the Medicaid monies that are available and ask for a waiver so that we're not going to expand Medicaid, but we're going to do a Florida solution to this insanity that exists. And what we will do is we'll take that money and create our own system that means that whoever receives these monies, and we'll take all those Medicaid monies, all of those monies, which over a period of 10 years is about $51 billion. And so you can count on that as being about $5 billion a year to pay for medical insurance for these people. Let's create a private free market concept. Let's go ahead and require whoever receives it to have a job. If they don't have a job, they're looking for a job. And if they don't have a job, they're getting an education. What a unique concept. A concept that in fact incentivizes people to do well, and it's a hand up, not a handout. And so what we did is we came up with this idea that this would be the template. As to these 800,000 people, we would take the federal monies because we knew that the LIP monies were going to go away. Because we've been told that the LIP monies were going to go away, and we couldn't build a budget of $2 billion from the federal government for LIP monies that they had told us that they were going to go away a year ago. And so we began this debate, is how do we stop what has been a continuation of an insane situation. And so we went ahead and began this debate. And what we did is we did find out, of course, that the LIP monies are being taken away. The LIP monies were reduced, I guess, about $1 billion this year. So we had to go dig around and find $450 million from the general revenue, monies that would be available for education, for health care, for the environment. And we went ahead and we backfilled using general revenue to fill up this hole that's created by the reduction in LIP monies. All the while that these monies are available from Medicaid, not to do Medicaid because we don't want to do Medicaid because we know it doesn't work. We want to do something that's an alternative to it, which is a Florida solution to a significant problem. And so what has happened is that debate went on. And any time that you have a transformational debate on something as great as this, sometimes it's sort of like taking 25 pounds of flour and trying to put it in a 10-pound sack. You just can't get it done in 60 days. And so we began the debate, and that overshadowed a lot. Everybody thinks, they don't hear all the great successes that we had in the legislature. And my friends in the House, let me tell you, I appreciate their views. We're going to find a solution to this. We are going to find a solution to it. They are our partners in this, and I believe that we will work out something. We're going to have to, because I don't see us, as the federal government ultimately cuts out the LIP monies. These are the monies that go to the hospitals to continue using their emergency rooms as primary care facilities for uninsured people. I said, we come up with a solution, because otherwise we're going to be taking your money, your general revenue, you're paying taxes, and using it to continue this insanity. And I don't think you want it, and we don't want it. So that's what's going on.
Okay. Eric, for all of that persuasiveness, the House wasn't buying what the senator was selling, really. Give us a little different view from what the House was doing. And then he did make what I thought was a very interesting comment, that it is something that is an ongoing process. And where will we go with this as we get into the next round of legislative deliberations? But why didn't the House want to do this?
Well, first let me say, you'll notice that that Mike and I have beards. And that's because when we heard this meeting, we heard that we were going to have to sit up here with two senators. We thought we better look tough. It's the best idea we had, right?
I look old. You look tough.
Well, look, I think that's the focus. Is look. The legislative process is it's difficult for a reason. We intentionally make it difficult to pass things. That's a good thing. It forces us to be deliberative. And I don't think while it's certainly not an ideal situation to go into special session for the budget, look, we got it done. We got the budget done. We passed a balanced budget, and we did the responsible thing. I think the House side on this is, and by the way, I respect my colleagues in the Senate who disagree with me on Medicaid expansion. I'm emphatically against it. I respect my House colleagues. You know, we had, I think, four Republicans vote for it in the House. I have an immense amount of respect for them. And certainly there's no doubt, I can say this without a doubt, we need healthcare reform. The current healthcare system that is controlled by the federal government, or the federal government has a stranglehold on it and they dictate everything to us, clearly is not working. There is absolutely no doubt it is not working. I think the House just thinks we ought to take a different approach. And so I'm not going to attempt to address everything that the senator said. And the senator left out a lot of facts that he could have said, probably, so on their side.
I was limited in the amount of time
Exactly.
that I could say this. It's a lot to try to capsulize and
I mean,
summarize. But these guys are bright. We'll work it out.
I don't know how long the Senate spent in debating, but in the House, I think we spent about 8 hours in just one day, just in debate on the bill. That
I
doesn't.
think Representative Workman represented to us this morning that is the longest debate on the floor of the House on a single piece of legislation ever. So close.
Well, if my rules chairman said it, then I'm going to go with it. But it was a long time. I do recall Senate Bill 6 going to 1 in the morning. That seemed like forever, but maybe it was just because it was 1 in the morning. I don't know. But we were on the floor a long time, and a lot of folks supported it, and they had passionate arguments, and a lot of folks opposed it. So there's no way we could possibly cover the whole issue here. But a few highlights. I think from the House's perspective, there's a number of arguments to be made and a number of concerns about Medicaid expansion. And the one I always go to, and frankly the only one I personally need to know where I stand on the issue, is simply this. In 1998-99, in Florida, our budget, it was 18% of the budget. Medicaid was 18% of the budget. That's how much our budget was in Florida for Medicaid. Today, it's over 30%. We're not talking about a growth in real dollars, although it has grown in real dollars quite drastically. We're talking about a growth as a part of the pie. We're talking about a percentage growth. It is swallowing the budget. If you go to my Twitter account, you can see, if you want to see the visual, I have a pie chart for the 18%, and I have a pie chart for the 31%. Okay, so that's where we're going. And I think a lot of House members, and I was in this category, to say, look, we're going to take a program that is already growing, an entitlement program that's already growing at an alarming rate, very clearly. I mean, nobody can argue with that. And instead of talking about how we bring that spending and that expense under control, we're talking about making the monster bigger. And to me, just the mere fact that we spent 8 hours debating whether we should make that program even bigger than it is today is, just unfathomable. I can't even comprehend why we weren't spending 8 hours talking about how to bring the cost under control. But we spent 8 hours talking about whether we should make that problem bigger. Now, ultimately, the House said no, we should not. We can't afford it. My children can't afford it, and neither can yours. Now, look, you'll hear, well, the federal government's paying for it, so why shouldn't we take the money? I mean, there's a number of responses to that, I suppose. Number one, the federal government's not, sending dollars back to Florida. They're printing it. I mean, that's what they're doing. They're printing the money, in essence, to pay for it. But they're not. But even if that wasn't bad enough, or even if that was okay, that only lasts for 3 years. It doesn't last for 10 years. They don't pay 100% for 10 years. They said that they pay 100% for 3 years. And after that, they go to 90%. And then after 10 years, there's no promise as to what the percentage will be. Will it continue to be 90-10? Your guess is as good as mine. Will it go at the end of 10 years? Will it go to the current percentages, which are 60-40? Your guess is as good as mine. I would suggest to you this: even if it's only 90-10, we have a program that has gone from 18% of the budget to 31% of the budget since 1998-99. Even if the state's only going to contribute 10% of that expense, is that something we want to do? I think the House just felt, no, we absolutely can't do it. If you look in the paper in the last couple weeks, there's even been more information come out on other states that have expanded Medicaid. And what we see time and time again is that the cost to expand Medicaid for these entitlement programs, and it sort of almost doesn't really matter how it was done and how you tweak it and all that, it always costs far more than they project. I haven't seen a single example of it costing what they projected. Every example I've seen, now maybe there's one I've missed, but every single example that I've seen, the cost has not just been more, it has been far more. They have blown the lid in every single state that I'm aware of. And again, there might be a state that I'm not familiar with. And so I think that when you just look at the cost, now other members of the House had problems with, Medicaid doesn't work, and there is evidence that Medicaid doesn't work, that the health outcomes aren't good. And so I think that from my perspective, and I think from the House's perspective, we think healthcare reform should look like this. It ought to be focused on reducing the cost of healthcare. That's where the focus should be. It shouldn't, and look, here's the thing, Medicaid expansion doesn't do one thing to reduce the cost of healthcare. One thing I'm excited about, I've felt for a couple years now that hospitals ought to open their eyes, and they ought to be transformative about the way that they're doing their ERs. And look, it's hard to do that, right? You're running a hospital. Hospitals are huge entities. They have to be. And so it's not like you can turn that ship on a dime, right? But we've got to rethink the way we're doing these. And I've asked for several years now, why don't ERs have a clinic set up near the ER? And when somebody comes in who doesn't have an emergency, why aren't we sending those folks right across the way, 50 feet this way, to a clinic where we can treat them for pennies on the dollar compared to what we're going to do in the ER? Why didn't hospitals do that 10 years ago? And the answers I got were sort of everything from deer in headlights, gee, like we haven't thought of that, to we're not sure the law will allow us to do it, things of that nature. Well, a few months ago I found out Lakeland Regional already does that. And so, and I recently spoke to folks at another hospital who are currently exploring ways to do that, and they're trying to push into that sort of reform. These are the things, and these are the things we ought to be doing to reduce the cost of healthcare. It just makes sense. The legislature ought to be taking up measures, and we did this year. The Florida House took up several measures that we believe would reduce the cost of healthcare. That's the real solution, I think, from the House's perspective.
Thank you, Eric. And I can see David making massive notes here, and I'm going to give him a chance to rebut in a minute. But let me stay on the budget and go to Darren briefly and then to Mike. And David, I promise I'll come back.
Thank you.
I want to stay in a budget-related item. I know when I served, and I think probably this is true throughout Florida, you're always proud of what you're able to bring back to your constituency. One of the big issues for Central Florida this year in the budget successfully passed by the legislature was the downtown campus for UCF, and that did not survive the line item veto process. So my question to you is, will that be back in the 2016 session, and is there the ability, do you think, to change the governor's feeling in that regard?
Well, it was a tough special session on budget, as you could see, and we had to backfill $400 million. On top of that, there was over $460 million worth of vetoes by Governor Scott, and a lot of them landed in our backyard here, primarily because of the debate you're seeing right now, which was that the governor penalized a lot of senators, it appeared at least, for their heroic stance on Medicaid expansion, and in this case, the FIX program, which was drawing down federal dollars for a private program. What we saw is UCF would have helped it be able to transform our downtown, much like they're doing in Phoenix right now and other areas of the nation. This was a huge priority of not only mine, but of our president, Senator Gardner, and of course Senator Simmons and others. We think regionally around here, and it was, I have no doubt, a priority of both our representatives here as well. We all are pretty united on budget items. Even if we may disagree on a lot of policy items, you'll see quite a lot of consensus on that. You'd agree with that, right?
Absolutely.
And so
Mike's nodding his head too.
yeah,
I did.
I'm sorry, I should have asked both of you.
Okay. I'm a
really was
freshman.
being selective. So it was pretty disappointing to see $15 million for the UCF campus be vetoed. In addition, $10 million for the Arts Center be vetoed. But it wasn't all bad. I was able to bring back $11.9 million to help create a Poinciana Valencia campus in my district, which is an area that many of you may be familiar with in South Osceola County that we're still having to deal with a lot of infrastructure projects down there. And then we also got the Sensor Manufacturing Center vetoed $10 million that both Senator Gardner and I pushed very heavily for. So it was, I think, $460 million was a little more than what needed to be done, particularly with the fact that there were a lot of economic development projects. I do want to end with a few different numbers to add to the healthcare debate, if I may, for a brief moment.
Absolutely.
Of why you should care, since there's been so much talk about it. First, 1.6 million. That's the number of Floridians on the healthcare exchanges. We have the biggest federal exchange in the nation. It cut our uninsured by a third in the state. No other solution ever has done that since Medicaid back in the day. Why you should also care, because your insurance rates will be substantially affected. If we don't convert everybody to coverage, then insurance companies will want to get it from your plans. There's no question about it. That's why you see the $50 aspirin or a procedure that costs hundreds of dollars and you wonder why, because it's only 15 minutes. If they can't get it from the indigent care sector of what they're doing because they're not getting any reimbursement from it, they're going to take it out of the business sector and out of the public sector to the extent that we have health insurance. That's why you should care. In addition, $52 billion that won't be in our economy, that would have been in our economy. Many other conservative states have done this. Ohio, Arizona, Alaska just did it. If it was that awful, why are all these states coming around to it? Because they realize they have to finish up this continuum to get everybody coverage. And so $52 billion in the economy, you know how many doctors, how many nurses, how many clinics, how many additional hospital wings, how many different things in the hospital and biotech and medical sector that would support? It's unfathomable. And so those are just things to think about. And then lastly, we had to use $400 million of your tax dollars to backfill because LIP is going away. And next year it could be as much as $1 billion. So that's $1 billion less dollars for all the projects that you're all hoping to get in the budget, that we're all hoping to get in the budget to improve our community. So the failure to do this will hurt businesses long term and will leave us behind.
Mike, I feel like I've kind of lost control of my panel here, so if you want to talk about this too, you can.
We
But
can
my
talk about
question to you...
There's a lot of other things we do in the legislature. Go back to the local bills if you want.
No, actually, I sort of. One of the things that's important, I think, for economic development and economic health for all of the state is good transportation networks. And I know both you and David Simmons were companion sponsors of some revisions to the Central Florida Expressway Authority Act. What's behind that? It didn't make it because it actually sort of fell victim to this debate. I don't think there was lots of controversy about it. We just ran out of time, did we not? And so my question is, what's it about, and will it be back again in 2016?
Well, I appreciated Senator Simmons' leadership on this.
And by the way, Eric needs a little help, so just jump right in there and give him some help.
So Senator Simmons actually passed some very significant legislation with the fellow representative Mike LaRosa last year, which did a lot of good things to clean up, which has been, we've all read about the Expressway Authority through the years, and I think it was actually a wonderful piece of legislation. But as we talked about in other conversations, when you put a legislation through, sometimes you look back and you say, geez, we might have actually literally spelled something wrong. You can look at the statute, and a couple of places they left Central Florida Expressway Authority and changed the nomenclature was still the old stuff. So it was technically what we had called a glitch bill. And I had another great experience going through the legislative process because I was assigned to different committees, so I got to get grilled by different members of the legislature. And then at the end of the day, it was on the docket the day we adjourned. And that was an interesting conversation to have, because at the same time that it had come over from the Senate, and there's a lot of things about waiting for things to come over, messaging, but we had that bill ready to go. And there were some amendments that were floating around, which was starting to give me a little bit of heartburn, but we never got there. So I'm hoping that this time around we'll get the amendments either cleaned up or not agended, and then we'll have our expressway glitch bill cleaned up, because again, it's a wonderful piece of legislation that I was proud to be a part of with Senator Simmons.
Okay, great. Now, David, I wanted to move on to water.
Sure.
And was going to ask you a question about that, but I promised you rebuttal. So jump right in there and
right.
talk a little bit about it, then I'd like to talk a little bit about the big water bill that didn't make it.
All right. This is my rebuttal with respect to the healthcare issue. The Senate was not proposing Medicaid expansion, so don't look at it that way. What we were proposing is ultimately Medicaid extinction. How do you go ahead and get rid of a system where 2.5 million Floridians are receiving these monies and being incentivized not to succeed? And the way you do it is you start weaning yourself from this system, because you think, is there any relationship with what happened in West Baltimore and what's happening all across America? And the answer is absolutely. There are a group of people who are not sharing in the American success story. And the reason why is because they're incentivized not to succeed, not to be educated. I mean, education is a great equalizer. If you want to solve the problems that exist with poverty in America, you go ahead and make sure that people have jobs and they're educated and working. And this is a new world in which education is the key to success. And say these children, these people who are 1/3 African Americans, 1/3 white, and 1/3 Hispanic, making up 2.5 million people in the state of Florida who are receiving Medicaid, that we need to get off Medicaid. And the only way to do that is not just cut it off. You heard that Representative Eisnaugle gave you all the problems, but there's no solution unless we go ahead and start weaning ourselves from a broken system. And the way to do that is use private enterprise with insurance companies providing these same services to assure that those who do receive the services are not penalized for their own success, which is having a job, making the money, and getting an education to do better. And so, what an astounding theory. The next thing that I want to talk about is water. And water, obviously, a vast majority, sometimes 75, almost 80% of Floridians voted in favor of the of Amendment 1. And I have been, along with various other senators, including Senator Soto, pushing for landmark legislation that we've passed in the Senate that will in fact clean up our springs. Our springs are in fact nothing other than a window to the aquifer that is the Floridan aquifer. You think about this, the Floridan aquifer is the source of 95% of the drinking water for Floridians north of the Orlando area. And then in South Florida, it's the Biscayne aquifer. If we don't go ahead and protect our aquifers, then we're going to find out that the success of the state of Florida, the economy of the state of Florida, is not going to sustain itself, because people are not going to come here to enjoy our beaches, our water, all of our resources, unless they believe that we have a pristine environment. And so we haven't solved that problem yet. Fortunately, this year, with respect to the obligations under Amendment 1, we did put approximately $750 million into all kinds of conservation projects. And we put nearly $50 million into springs restoration, which is a big, big thing that I was pushing for, and to get that $50 million. But we don't have the comprehensive plan yet. The comprehensive plan that is going to require that cities and all of the causes of the destruction of the Floridan aquifers, and thus the destruction of our springs, whether it's agriculture in a way that doesn't hurt agriculture, and when we're talking about the wastewater treatment facilities here in local governments, which used to put them in creeks up until the 1980s, now goes ahead and is taking these waters and percolating them out like we do in West Orange County, and letting them get down into ultimately the aquifer, the Floridan aquifer, and ultimately pollute the Floridan aquifer, and then it gets into Wekiva Springs. We've got to solve that problem. We've got to create a way to make it so that we get local governments to clean up what they're doing. Permit agriculture to use best practices so that they can clean up. Take those on-site septic tanks and take the worst that are creating a problem. Not go out and take them all, because that's too big of a task. But in fact, taking those septic tanks and the bad ones and either hooking them up or provide for a mechanism to clean them up. And so there are a lot of things that we can do. We need to have a comprehensive plan. We did do a lot in the way of funding for water restoration and preservation here in the state of Florida. And this is a big challenge that we're going to undertake. We're going to get it, and we're going to solve it in the next session.
Well, I was going to ask you, and let me just ask the panel, each one, just like yes or no. I know this legislation was very close to being completed. David, I know you've been working on it for years. Did it just get caught in the bigger debate, and are we close to moving it to a final passage in early 16? Mike, what do you think?
I might defer to Eric on this one, just because
You told me you were gonna do that, by the
wasn't
way.
it the first bill that we heard? Wasn't it the water? What did we
One
do?
of.
Water. It was the first one we heard.
So
right?
we're close. I mean, that's something that can happen. Darren, what do you think?
Well, it seems the House has prioritized unifying the system that we use for water quality around Lake Okeechobee. The Senate has prioritized the springs, and we've been trying to incorporate both ideas into one large bill. We did run out of time, I guess is the nice way to put it, in the regular session. And so that, among other major bills, we'll have to relook at next year. It's oftentimes that we'll have a major package in criminal justice or in transportation or in the environment, and a lot of those bills are worked up until the last possible moment. So I believe that there was a good chance they would have passed this year, and I still believe there's a good chance that they'll pass next year, particularly because we have allowed the House to take the lead on the Lake Okeechobee issues, and we in the Senate have taken the lead on the spring issues, and we're sort of melding the two bills together.
I really want to leave some time for questions from the audience, so we're about to run out of time, and I know there are commitments that need to be made. But Mr. Rules Chairman, let me ask you this one final question before we go to the audience. We are now going to be in special session beginning, August the 10th through the 21st?
Correct.
To redraw congressional district lines. Congressman,
Correct.
do you know where your district's going to be?
I have no idea.
No idea. Okay, we're working on that part of it. My question really is, anything else going to be in the call? I know there's nothing there now. We're going to do the
I don't-
compact, we're going to do the water bill.
I don't believe so. I think that we've got a big challenge that the Florida Supreme Court has imposed upon us. We want to make absolutely sure we comply with not only the letter but the spirit of the Florida Supreme Court's ruling. We want to make sure that we have a full, complete, transparent, open process that will permit the redrawing of the districts in coordination with and pursuant to the Florida Supreme Court's ruling.
Okay, I've got more questions up here myself, but we've got about 4 minutes left, and I'd really like to give you an opportunity. Are there questions out there? Yes, sir.
This regarding the sunshine law, I think it's archaic. Seems to be in the age of the internet. Teresa wants to talk to Ted. You ought to be able to go into a room, stream it to the web for all time, and talk. Anybody talking about a blue sky amendment to the sunshine law?
Gentlemen, anybody?
I'll
Politically
defer to the
unfeasible.
lawyers.
Politically unfeasible to make any changes to that.
Well, I would say because in that case, you're talking about two county commissioners, our mayor and our county commissioner here. I would say that we'd have to get a lot of folks in the legislature to fully understand technology. So it's not out of the question, because you would think, and keep in mind with the county commissioners, it's much more strict. We're allowed to have 3 members or more has to be noticed for legislators. So I could see a potential of doing that, but it would take a couple of years of familiarizing everybody on the technology that would be used.
I have a question with regard to both the Senate and the House version on Medicaid, whether there's any consideration for fraud and waste in the program. Has that come up in any of the discussions, the overall projections of fraud and waste, especially in South Florida?
Let me repeat it just because I've got the mic, and the question is, any consideration in this Medicaid expansion given to potential Medicaid fraud? And Eric, I'm going to turn immediately to you because I think that was part of what was covered in your bill to expand the authority to the statewide prosecutor, but maybe I'm...
And the senator's worked a lot on this issue as well, so he may have something to add to it. But I think that, it's always part of the debate. It certainly was discussed within the debate. Medicaid fraud was certainly, there was an element of that in our bill.
Do we have an estimate?
Well, there are estimates. However, I think that if you were to talk to the folks in the Attorney General's office, they would tell you that they don't know if they're very accurate estimates. I think it's one of those things that's very, very, I mean, there are certainly estimates. I mean, we could go find estimates and, but I think I don't know if there's a lot of confidence that those estimates are accurate. What's clear is that there is an immense amount of fraud there. The problem is it's very, very sort of FTE intensive, right? You basically have to put boots on the ground to go sniff it out and prosecute it and things of that nature. And so, I almost don't know if we could have, I'm not sure we could have too many Medicaid fraud investigators. I'm not sure you ever hit that point where there's too many. Of course, just the reality is at some point the legislature just can't fund more of them. But I think it's an immense problem. I think the solution is the hard part.
Yes, ma'am.
One aspect to
We have a
that.
solution in the Senate, and that's turn it over to private enterprise, and guess what? They'll take care of these kind of problems. And you can't hire enough prosecutors to prosecute the fraud that exists in Medicaid and Medicare fraud. It is overwhelming, and there has to be a solution. And every time that there is a problem like that with government that is too big and too cumbersome and ineffective and inefficient and is full of fraud, you know what you do? Go back to the private enterprise, and you know what? You'll find that if you're not efficient, you'll go out of business. And that's what needs to be done.
If I could actually just interject there real quick. Nobody's talking about taking the current Medicaid program and doing anything to privatize it. There's no discussion of that. There's not a proposal of that, the current Medicaid. The only sort of proposal is to expand it and make the expanded part sort of have private companies involved. It would still be the same federal dollars, the same population to coverage, the same federal rules. It would still be federal and state tax dollars paying for it, but it would be sort of rendered by the private companies. But let's be clear, there's no proposal to take the current Medicaid program, the one that's grown from 18% to 31%, and privatize that.
No, the proposal is to, in fact, create a template with the 800,000 using private enterprise that is not Medicaid, but in fact is an alternative, and then prove that it works, and then go ahead and tackle what keeps growing, and if we don't stop it, is going to consume us.
I have time for one question that can last less than a minute. Yes, ma'am.
Senator Simmons knows me pretty well, and so does Barrett.
Now I've got 45 seconds.
Okay.
Question is,
The question is, you're talking about privatizing. Are you talking about managed Medicaid, which is a total disaster?
No, I'm not. I'm talking about an alternative to managed care.
I would love to hear that.
Okay, I'm talking
Well-
about an alternative.
okay, all right, one more in the back.
Switch subject. Amendment 1, just briefly, impact that process going on the budget, and also getting back to the water issue with Amendment 1.
And the question is?
Just an overview of how that process is going now, in implementing Amendment 1.
Okay, what we have,
All right,
Is there
let's do
somebody
this.
else that wants to
The
answer?
question is implementation of Amendment 1. There are two pieces of that. One's the funding. I think Senator Simmons indicated that that standard was met. Is that correct?
yes, we've complied with the constitutional requirement of taking the 30% of the dock stamps and putting it into the Land Acquisition Trust Fund, which is approximately about $750 million. And we have spent that $750 million for things that are related to and in accordance with the constitutional amendment. What we have not done is pass legislation, which we were on the cusp of doing. We were truly on the cusp. And Kerry Roth, who is a tremendous leader from the governmental affairs who's knowledgeable about this. We were so close. And then, of course, the legislature didn't finish.
I apologize, and it excites me that there is this interest in this, but we are now right up on our time, and I know
Pete,
there
I
are
can stay a few extra minutes if everybody else can. This is kind of fun.
Well, here's what I was going to suggest that we do, is that we have reception and opportunity for people to stay and talk, because I think we may have other questions out there, and it would be an opportunity to do it, if that would work for you. And then,
If I could just address the Amendment 1 issue, something that hasn't been said is that a lot of times we hear folks upset that we didn't purchase more land with the roughly $750 million. According to my calculation, about $50 million went to the purchase of new land. But what people don't realize is that the amendment that we passed actually doesn't just say purchase new land. It actually has a bunch of categories of things that we're supposed to do. And frankly, some of it's long overdue. Things like, getting rid of invasive species, Melaleuca taking over private or publicly owned land because nobody's paying attention, nobody's even looked at it in 2 decades, and it's not old Florida anymore because we're not taking care of it. And so a lot of that money, we talked about the springs too, but a lot of that money is has been earmarked for things like maintaining the land that we already own and being good stewards of that land, eradicating species that aren't supposed to be here and things of that nature. And so there's a bunch of things that kind of go into that Amendment 1 bucket. And it's not just purchasing land. And so, but a lot of folks have sort of thought that we were just going to spend all of the money on the purchase of land, and you have to kind of explain that no, the amendment actually has a bunch of other elements to it.
I want to do this. You have unintentionally, what you have been able to enjoy this afternoon is the kind of debate and passion that we watched in the session in Tallahassee. The issues are difficult. The numbers are big. As you can tell, very articulate points of view, and finding the middle ground is not the easiest of chores at all times, but they've been successful in doing it. With that thought in mind, hopefully we'll be able to have some conversation. I'd like to, Carrie Roth, please stand up. This is part of our governmental team. Martha Edenfield, come where you can be seen, please, so that when you have questions, along with the members, we're happy to try and engage as well. And with that thought in mind, gentlemen, I can't thank you enough. Help me thank our guests.